Good afternoon and welcome to the Austin Software Cooperative's meetup for October. We are going to be reviewing Technofeudalism again. It's going to be chapter 5, and we're going to hopefully get through this. I think this is one of the more important chapters. Let's move forward. Title of the chapter is What's in a Word? And I can say at the outset here that what the author, Yanis Varoufakis, is interested in here is convincing us that rent and profit are two different things, isolating them, and then saying that um, technofeudalism relies on rent. So a little bit more of his background. He is an economist. He's also a professor, and he kind of uses the definition of rent as an important teaching tool for his students when he's trying to describe modern economics. So let's get into this first introduction of the chapter. When he's talking about, again, what was feudalism and what's the difference between feudalism and capitalism, he's gonna say that feudalism relies on rent and capitalism does not, and we're gonna tease that out. But one of the reoccurring themes that I think is important is this statement here. Why didn't we call capitalism market feudalism? Because there were markets in feudalism. That might be a controversial statement, but that's his position. So let's get further into that. So in the 1770s, we had feudalism all over. There are feudal lords dominating rural areas, so on and so forth. And this is going all the way through the time of the 1840s when Karl Marx was writing about capitalism and how it's taking over. And he is saying that even during that time, land ownership remained the main source of political authority, and rent continued to be more powerful than profit. Right? And then something critically important would have been lost if those who forged the language of that era have been reluctant to ditch the word feudalism, choosing to call the nascent system not capitalism, but industrial or market feudalism. Again, the name of this chapter is What's in a Word. He's taking the position that naming something and making it distinct, so techno-feudalism versus another form of capitalism, is important. And he's taking the position here that they named capitalism instead of something brand new, capitalism instead of, say, market feudalism. So wherever we look today, we see capitalism dominant. It dominates parliaments, government bodies, global institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and WTO. Here's a little logical argument here. If markets existed under feudalism but were not the defining feature, then markets alone do not define a system like capitalism. So once again, if markets existed under feudalism, and he's saying they did, but were not the defining feature, then markets alone do not define the system like capitalism. And he's saying markets did exist under feudalism, therefore markets did not define capitalism. moving along, we talked in previous chapters about what the definition of property and enclosure is part of that definition. And then so this whole idea of digital enclosure and making property, how that leads towards technofeudalism and other things. So he's saying the enclosure of the internet commons and the cloud capital um, differs from other kinds of capital in its ability to reproduce itself at no expense to the owner. So it turns us all into cloud serfs. We're going to see how that's the case. We talked about Amazon, and then now operates as a cloud fief or fiefdom. We've seen that how the cloudalists, the big tech, achieved all this riding on the waves of central bank money that made profits optional. This is important. Profits being optional. What is that all about? Here's a logical argument. If cloud capital extracts rent without competing in markets, then it's not driven by profit, but by rent. We're going to talk about the difference between profit and rent. But he's saying profits were optional. And he's saying that cloud capital extracted rent without competing in the markets. So it's driven by rent, not profit. What in essence changed? What in the simplest possible terms distinguishes this world from the previous one, demanding that we discard the word capitalism and replace it with techno-feudalism? It's the triumph of rent over profit. So we're going to get into this rent's revenge. What is this all about? Capitalism prevailed when profit overwhelmed rent. For the transformation of productive work and property rights into commodities to be sold via labor and shared markets, respectively. Whereas rent reeked of vulgar exploitation, profit claimed moral superiority as a just reward to brave entrepreneurs risking everything to navigate the treacherous currents of stormy markets. So that's what we're familiar with. We'll say that, you know, people that take all the risks and maybe do all the work, maybe they're the smartest, they're the ones that deserve through equitability, implying equitability, those who do more should get more, kind of a meritocracy. Uh, they should receive the profit or control over the profit. And that would be a moral argument. And he's saying that that moral argument is why profit and therefore capitalism beat, is one of the reasons why it beat feudalism. It's morally superior. There's plenty of people who wrote about that, even um, Adam Smith. The title of Adam Smith, um, one of his books, is The Moral Philosophers, or it's about morality. It's not The Moral Philosophers, it's something else, but it's about morality. And he talked often about why what we know of capitalism now is morally superior and increases one of the things that increases everyone's standard of living. But this would be another one. The ones who you could say work harder, they deserve more of the lion's share. So that would be profit. And so the author's standpoint is going to be that rents are going to be a throwback to feudalism, which loses the moral support. All right, so we have capitalist mega firms like Ford, Edison, so on and so forth, They generated profits and it outweighed the rents and propelled capitalism to its dominance. But oil companies, there are few companies that were still based on rent, have raked in gargantuan ground rents from the right to drill on particular plots of land and ocean beds, not to mention unearned privilege to damage the planet. Oil companies have attempted to legitimize their loot by presenting it as capitalist profit. And that's a thing that I'm familiar with reading about strategies that oil companies they do present it as something that is very difficult, very risky to decide where to drill. It may cost $1 billion to put up one of those oil rigs. And so they deserve the lion's share of what they're doing. So the author's view is that they're really disguising rent as profit. And that's the strategy because of this moral argument that you could say modern feudalists, maybe, or he calls them maybe traditional feudalists, not cloud capitalists or cloud feudalists, techno-feudalists have to take, they had to disguise it. And he said the same is true for real estate development, where the ground rent overshadows any profit from the innovative architecture. So we don't really think of people building out homes as some type of superior innovation, and that's why, let's say, landlords with this superior innovation in the homes, and that's why they deserve this profit. It's really no, they just were the first one to buy the plot of land. Same thing with electricity or water utilities. There's really no innovation there. So he calls them the mega rentiers. What they have in common is a strong motive to legitimize their rents by disguising them as profits. That's going to come into play later. We talked in one of the chapters about the manufacture of the control of attention and creating desire in products as part of the evolution of capital. And he's bringing that back in, saying that's brand loyalty. So Mercedes Benz or Apple Computer, uh, you could have a cheaper equivalent, but they can charge more because of these brand, and he's calling it rent. So he's bringing this word back in, right? And so now this is the ushering in of the techno feudalists. He's arguing that Apple was the beginning of this. So Apple, beautiful design and famed user friendliness that ultimately allowed Apple to charge significant amounts for brand rent. That was the beginning. But then when they came out with the iPhone, they had the opportunity for cloud rent. So this unlocked cloud rent for Steve Jobs. His radical idea was to invite third-party developers to use free Apple software, uh, the development and compilation tools and all that, uh, uh, to produce applications for sale via the Apple Store, right? And he's saying that they could never have produced the products that are in the Apple Store themselves. One of the, I guess, key components of techno-feudalism is supposed to be that you get free work versus traditional feudalism. You're working, the serfs were working 4 or 5 days out the week, and that was going to the landlord, and then they could keep the rest of the crops for themselves. This is all free. the owner is receiving everything for free. That's the new trick. So Apple's unwaged third-party developers maintain partnerships or small capitalist firms had no choice but to operate via the Apple Store. The price, 30%. Anything you put in the Apple Store, 30%. Then we had Google. They developed Android as a competitor. All of these other companies that had handsets that were getting beat out in the market, they liked Android, and that was the strategy. It would work on all of their handsets, and then also to lure third-party developers to produce apps, not only for the Apple Store, but now the new store, the Android store, so Google Play. So Google got into the game, and then they were doing their cloud rents, right? So extracting gargantuan cloud rents from the vassal capitalists. So vassal capitalists would be, for instance, Sony, BlackBerry, and Nokia. They're not getting cloud rents. They're left out of the game. They're vassals. What does that mean? They're people who basically collect the rent for the king who has the, or a feudal lord who has the rights to get the rent. So you got the collectors who can take a little bit off, but the lion's share goes to, I won't even just say the lion's share, but the least amount of innovation and the least amount of work, but getting profit or getting, rent compensation is the feudal lord or the techno-feudalist. So the vassal capitalists have continued to enjoy the power to command labor from the majority who are relying on wages. So this is traditional capitalism. And they continue to own at least some of the means of production, so computers, so on and so forth. But that's it. Not all vassal capitalists are small scale artisans. Some of them are big, like Sony, BlackBerry, and Nokia. And they're by definition dependent on a greater or to a lesser extent selling their wares on an e-commerce site, whether Amazon, eBay, or Alibaba, or with a sizable portion of their net earnings being skimmed off by the cloudless that they depend on. So that's that. We'll go right on through. Um, Cloudlists don't need to deploy bailiffs to compensate or evict, right? So this is traditional feudalists. Um, they had to use coercion. Instead, vassal capitalists know that with the removal of a link from their cloud vassal's site, they could lose access to the bulk of their customers. And with the removal of a link or two Google search engine, or from a couple of e-commerce or social media sites, they could disappear from online world altogether. So, for instance, if you are making, let's say, music, and you upset the cloud list, so YouTube or Spotify or what have you, you're done. You need to let them collect their rent. And so this harkens back to his definition of capital power. So there isn't just what people would traditionally think of capital as like this employer-employee contract and the profit and then taking risk and all that, but there's also power with capital and the ability to say you no longer can make money at all and there's no other game in town but the market that I control. He's saying that that's what kind of like what a feudal lord is like and less of what a capitalist is like. So there you go there. If there's any questions, feel free to ask. So one of the things is feudal lords, they really were all about control. Cloudalists, it's like an argument could be, and the author here is going back and forth in an imaginary discussion with his father, saying, his father being a traditional critique of capital, maybe a Marxist critique or something of capital, and saying, "Ah, it's just capitalism." And he's saying, "No, this is something new." So here he's saying, feudal lords never invested. And he's arguing that the new group here that you're talking about, say at Facebook or whatever, they're doing plenty of investment. And so he's going back and forth talking about that. And it's going to come down to the whole rent thing and risk and innovation. So he's saying, he's talking to his dad. He said, Cloudalist invested in the creation of new commodities, but a commodity is a thing or service produced to be sold for a profit, right? So he's saying this is not happening. Search results are not produced to be sold. Alexa and Siri do not answer our questions for a fee. Like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, WhatsApp, their purpose is entirely different: to capture and modify our attention. So to collect cloud rent from vassal capitalists who are in the old-fashioned business of selling their commodities, what do? They use their cloud power, or it's like what a feudal lord would do. Then he's saying that the cloudless investment is not aimed at competing within a market, but in getting us to exit capitalist markets altogether. Right? So we'll see this over and over, this exiting markets thing. So there's some arguments. If cloud capital extracts rent without competing in markets, then it's not driven by profit, but by rent. Right? So again, it extracts rent without competing in the market. So it's not driven by profit, but by rent. If the primary function of cloud capital is rent extraction, then it bypasses traditional market competition, right? So these are things that the arguments that the author is making, putting forth. Rent gets around markets, right? So you think of a landlord, they're not about innovation. They're about collecting rent. Saying fundamental difference between feudalism and capitalism is rent and profit, and collecting rent. And what is that? Whatever it is, it don't have nothing to do with innovation. All right. So cloudalists are now becoming fabulously wealthy without needing to organize production of any commodity. Not only that, they are free from the pressure of a market to produce cheaper, better commodities, or indeed the constant fear that a competitor might come in up with a product that steals their market share. Now, the father pushes back, says, well, you know, they have rivalries like TikTok and so forth. They have people that will come in YouTube, have a competitor like TikTok. Here we go. Now he pushes back and says rivalries also happened in feudalism. They were part of feudalism, right? And so people could leave from one fiefdom and go to another, just like how you can move from one city and go to another. So, but we don't really look at cities as being in capitalistic competition with one another. We don't look at the fiefdoms as being in capitalistic competition with one another. So he's saying we shouldn't confuse rivalry between fiefs with market-based competition. TikTok created a new cloud fief for cloud serfs in search of a different online experience to migrate. That's how he argues for TikTok versus YouTube. And then Disney Plus, when it came out, versus Netflix, he's saying they didn't offer audiences new innovation, lower prices, new definition formats, so on and so forth. It offered its own database of its content and a newly established cloud fief, right? It just wanted to lure users. So there we go there. We're gonna push through here. This is talking about Elon Musk. So Elon Musk, he basically defines Elon Musk as a traditional capitalist, and he wanted to play and get part of what he's calling the ruling class, which is the cloud capitalists. I would take issue with that, but um, these cloud capitalists, Elon wants to get in. Why did he buy Twitter? Well, um, he spent tens of billions of dollars on it. Why did he do it? Was it a bad move? Was it he's an ego move or something like that? He's saying it was a cloud capital move. He's saying that um, he wanted to use it as gateway to technofeudalism, will allow him to attract users' attention, modify their consumer behavior, and extract free labor from them as cloud serfs. And last but not least, charge vendors cloud rent and selling them for their wares, right? So this was when he said that he wanted to change Twitter into the everything app. He wanted to be able to have it to where it's basically like WeChat, where you can do everything inside. It's a Chinese app. You can do everything inside of it as far as like pay for things, transfer money. Think of it as like a Cash App, PayPal, and WhatsApp and Twitter and everything all in one. So he said, yeah, so you have your private thief Twitter, but it would never really be the world's public square. Now, could he really use it to build a prominent cloud fiefdom? Yet to be seen. But that's his strategy. He's saying. Now, this portion, he talks about what's he's calling the great inflation. And this, so you've got different views here. You've got the view that traditional idea, we talked about the money printing in the previous chapters. If you start printing money, it should be that all money, let's say the dollar, right? You start printing the dollar, all the other dollars should be worth less. Well, what would happen there would be inflation. Everything's worth less, then eggs go up in price, all this other stuff. So, how do we, economically reconcile this with techno feudalism? That's what he's trying to do in this space. Right. So, every transformation brings with it a new crisis. Techno feudalism is deepening pre existing sources of instability and turning them into existential threats. So, we had the great inflation and the cost of living crisis during the pandemic. So 2008, we had socialism for the bankers. So it's basically saying, hey, we'll cover all of your losses. Austerity, meaning tightening your belt. You're not going to get any handouts. You're not going to get any help for the rest of us. And that dampened investment, blunted Western capitalism's dynamic, and pushed it into a state of gilded stagnation. Let's see. And the idea of stagnation being money is not circulating and going into investments. All right, let's see how he argues this. By 2020, cloud rents accruing to the cloud capital accounted for much of the developed world's aggregate net income. It's a pretty strong statement, right? That, in brief, is how cloud rent gained the upper hand and profit retreated. Okay. Right? So we know previously he talked about they printed money, sent it into whoever was qualified to borrow it, which is only the big companies. They borrowed it, and then what did they do with it? They bought back their own stock. What else did they do with it? They invested it in places where they thought that the value was going to go the highest. Who was that? The cloud companies. Okay. So this was a thing where cloud capital was getting their advantage with this money printing. But what was not happening is no investment. There was no innovation, no investment. It was just people buying back their stock, and a lot of lion's share of that going to, I think they call it the Magnificent Seven top companies who are mostly cloud capital companies. All right. Uh, you don't have to be left leaning to know that rent's stunning comeback could only mean deeper and more toxic stagnation against, again, money not getting invested in regular people. That wages get spent by the many struggling to make ends meet. Profits get invested in capital goods to maintain capitalist capacity to profit, but rent is stashed away in property like mansions and art and cryptocurrencies, and stubbornly refuses to enter circulation and stimulate investment into useful things. Okay, there we go. All right, so that's what he's saying happened. For the first time since 2008, this is a pandemic, some of the fresh trillions printed by central banks were spent by governments on the population. So this is in the United States, like the PPC loans, all that kind of thing. Um, I would say it's something minuscule compared to what the loans that were going to the big banks were going. I'm sorry, the big companies and all that were doing. But they were doing something, right? So keep the citizens alive while locked down. Nonetheless, most of the new money ended up bolstering the share price of the big tech corporations. So the billionaires gained 27% during the lockdown. So, you know, that was just them buying back. And so when they buy back their own shares, that demand they're buying increases it, pumps up the share price. You talked about this in a previous chapter. So we got inflation. So we're printing money during pandemic. What's that about? And how do we explain that as far as an effect on if you're printing money, all of it should be worth less, right? So inflation, he's saying, is never just a monetary phenomenon. Just as money is never just a token of exchange value, when, for whatever reason, price surges across the board, a social power game is afoot. Okay, what's going on? Business managers try to work out how far they can raise prices, if not the profit from them. We hear that all the time, right? What else? Rentiers, both traditional and cloudless, test the water with rent hikes. All right. Workers assess the extent to which they can push for a pay raise and at least compensate for higher bills that they must meet. And governments play the game too. They intervene by using greater income and taxes flowing from the rising prices to assist weaker citizens. All right. And so during this situation, when the inflation, stagflation, stagnation, any of this is going on, he's saying power is what matters. If capital dominates, inflation ends when the workers accept a permanent reduction. Government dominates, like in China, inflation dissipates when capitalists and rentiers acquiesce to a chunk of their loot being used to pay off the debts, right? So, in a world going through its early techno-feudalist phase, it's subtle and woven into society's productive fabric. Traditional capital is further displaced by a new cloud capital, hastening and strengthening techno-feudalism's superarching reach. Right, and so that's really some of he was saying that the techno feudalists, even though there's this ebb and flow and that everybody was getting hit, they had a position, an advantageous position, and so they were hit a bit less and they were able to skim more off the top. Now, talking about Europe, again, the author was a finance minister of Greece, so he brings it back to Europe a lot. We have him talking about Germany. When we talk about world economics, macro, it's not just the United States. What are these other people doing? Well, in Germany, when it comes to techno feudalism, Did they sit by and, just accept that, the cloud capitalists are extracting rent from everyone? What are they doing? So he said the German capitalists failed to realize soon enough the benefits of investing in cloud capital, of becoming cloudless, and lag far behind in this new game. In practical terms, they're manufacturing themselves out of a competitive position, unable to collect sufficient cloud rents, and their surpluses suffer, and so will the economy of the European Union. An interesting thing about, let's say, Mercedes is they started playing around. I don't think it's in this book. I can't remember, but they started playing around with, they have the option in the car, different options, and you got to pay a monthly fee to turn it on. It's there. They could turn it off and turn it on remotely. And you pay that monthly fee and it's available. But if you don't, it's not. And so they're playing around with capturing data and then having rent and all this other stuff. But the authors argument's gonna fail as they were too slow, right? Um, so again, we're talking about inflation here. He started saying that fossil fuel, like we said before, they're traditional feudalistic, with them trying to disguise it as profit, but it's really rent. And he's saying renewables, actually, new energy, solar panels, these things, they lend themselves well to cloud capital. And so they're going to go that direction. And let's leave that alone. So let's probably try to finish this up. Got about 10 minutes. Mainstream economic commentators, when they were talking about how the inflation was happening, right? He's saying that they had a hard time. To them, inflation was the natural consequence of central bankers printing too much money and the government's overspending it during the pandemic, right? And he's saying that they're embarrassed. So the red-faced central bankers were forced to raise interest rates through 2022 in order to choke off demand and put a lid on rising prices. Normally solemn commentators were hardly able to contain their pleasure at the apparent admission of their mistake. Right. So I guess he's saying the mistake of the bankers. The Great Inflation 2022 was to them what the Stuart Restoration of 1660 had been to the British Royalists. Okay. Not only that, money became more expensive to borrow. So when they raise interest rates, money, that's the cost of money, in quotes, let's say, became more expensive to borrow and to hold. The mad years where money's price languished around zero had ended, right? So again, he talks about this in some of his videos, and other people do. You have the big corporate, they can literally borrow money literally for zero and turn around and just put it into a treasury. And so it's guaranteed 5%. So it's free money for them. And he's saying, oh, when that's gone, that trick's off the table, people get fired, people get laid off. Um, but there's a whole side of economics or commentators who are going to say, hey, that was crazy anyways, right? So this lending money for zero, that should have never been on the table. And he's saying, so since they raised the interest rate, sanity was restored. So there's a price to pay, of course, the familiar hangover after the party ended. With interest rates rising, financiers relying on borrowed money to pay back to play the stock exchanges were forced to exit the market, and unsurprisingly, share prices declined. And since the higher the rise, the harder the fall, it's the cloudless conglomerates whose stock exchange value had taken off during the pandemic that fell the most under the great inflation. During 2022, total share value of the big US tech shrank by 4 trillion. right? And so they're saying many people, even on the left wing, found similar solace in the great inflation. They abhor the hardships and inflation inflicts on the poor, but the welcome feeling that the world makes sense of them again. But not so fast. He's saying we're never going to go back. The currents of money, the central bank have already built around cloud capital. It's critical mass. It's not going anywhere, he's saying. They're going to always extract. Now they can extract cloud rent forever. Central bank money, it's not dry. It's still flowing. They're still printing. So it's a slower pace, but it's enough to keep the techno feudalism going. They can't afford to stem their flow completely, but they're going to continue to print. Even this is what they must do to defeat the great inflations. Recent bank failures in California, Switzerland reminded America and the central banks that if they dare to withdraw the trillions, they're going to hit this volatility and they're going to hit this $24 trillion market of debt, United States debt. It's going to be a problem. So they're going to be printing. Central bank money's here to stay, and they're going to continue to play and print. So he's saying whenever they print, that money is going to go into cloud capital. And he's saying, and they have to print. So cloud capital is now so well entrenched and augmented by central bank money, its own capacity to mass cloud rent. By every new development, it's going to increase. Well, that's the end of this chapter. Any questions?